Welcome to On the Edge with Deneen Irfan. Today I am live in Vancouver at the ITA Spring Conference, and Irfan from Penn has joined me. Could you please go ahead and introduce?
Absolutely. I'm Irfan Dossani. I'm partner in charge of our CAS practice at Penn. And I also have the honor of being the planning committee chair for ITA, which both Deneen and I are here today in Vancouver.
Yes, and if you're not familiar with ITA, can you please share what ITA is and then what we're representing here at ITA?
Absolutely. So ITA has been around for about 25 years, and it's really been made up of the top 50 accounting firms, CIOs, coming together and really having a place that they share ideas and bounce new innovations off of. And it's slowly been evolving into including some resellers in the technology space. And but 4 years ago, we piloted a CAS track. And when COVID happened, we went virtual, so we really didn't get a lot of traction till last year when we had our spring collaborative in Denver, and then this is really our second, if you really think about that, our second really good collaborative session that's happening at ITA for CAS here in Vancouver. So just to kind of give you a little bit more around the CAS track as well, Deneen, it's we have a little over 70 people in attendance in the CAS track. So if you think about the total IT attendance, is probably close to 300. And they've been at it for 25 years, and here we are as the kids on the block and trying to take over that. So the CAS track is really based around the top 100 firms, CAS leaders coming together. And so we've kind of expanded that definition to include more leadership around the CAS space, as it's still so new, and we feel like we really needed to, and especially with the acquisitions that continue to happen, that it's consolidating at such a rapid pace that we felt like that we really needed to look at it from a top 100 space. So with such great attendance, and getting all the CAS leaders and their team, a leadership team to come and join, it's a wonderful organization to be a part of.
Yeah, and I think this is my 4th year participating in ITA's CAS track, and it's wonderful to be here together. I mean, the power of communicating with others, sharing with each other the successes and the challenges, and that's what I feel is special about ITA, is that a lot of the sessions, it's very discussionary, where you have roundtable discussions, so everybody can learn from each other. And there is a lot of the CAS stuff is so new that there might not be an answer, but it's the collaboration, it's the discussion, and it's getting to know others within the large firms that are building out this new revenue source. Yeah.
We were just talking about that earlier, that how it feels like it's almost a reunion of sorts when these leaders come together, because we see each other. I think the last time we saw each other was Digital CPA in December.
Yep.
So it's almost like spring season changes, and all of a sudden we come out and really check in with each other. It's been 5 months or so since we've seen all of us, and so I think ITA feels like a reunion of sorts.
Yeah. Well, and tax season is over, so none of us have really been traveling, even though CAS is separate than tax. We really haven't been traveling, and so it is a reunion of getting together and collaborating. And so there's some great CAS. I mean, you chaired this year, and you had a really big board. Like, how many people were on the committee?
We had 10.
And that's bigger than last year.
Oh, yeah.
Last year was like 4 or 5. Yeah. And so your team of 10 have done a great job on the sessions. And we wanted to share with you some of our favorite sessions over the last 2 days, because I think they're really hot topics. And so the one we just left right now was BPO versus CAS. So do you want to we can give a little peek into what was being discussed?
Sure. So the thought process behind when we were kind of coming together as planning committee to think through topics, this was one of probably the most voted on topics, was there's a lot of intrigue around, we're struggling in some ways at the CAS level inside large firms to truly scale some of the services that we want to offer around CAS and CAS 2.0, the spectrum that we've been all trying to work towards. And what we find is that here we look at the BPO firms and we want to look over on the other side of the fence and go, well, what are they
What are they
doing?
doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think the goal was to really just come together and say, what does that model look like? And what does that CAS model look like? So on a BPO space, right, like we're looking at business process outsourcing, it's really doing the same type of services we do under outsource accounting, CAS, and it's really been try to do the same service outside of a CPA firm model. And so the some of the cool things about that session was we were able to dive deeper into, technology usage, verticalization, staffing, pricing, how does their team build out look like? And, overall their compensation and their ownership model, right? So one of the intriguing things to me is how their BPO, their ownership model looks so much like a small mid-sized business that's owned by one or two owners, a very corporate environment, or it might be an employee-owned company in a lot of ways. And they're getting really, really innovative with how they structure, the ownership around that as well. So that's one of those aha moments we get as CAS leaders, and we go, okay, we've got the partnership model here sitting inside an accounting firm, and then we've got inside a BPO, you're competing with a very nimble business
Yeah.
that makes decisions really quickly.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating, some of the things that we're talking about.
Well, and Botkeeper used to be a BPO,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was the different person in the room,
Mm-hmm.
but it was great to hear the discussion because that's how we started. And we're venture backed, and all we do, and we have our own technology, and all we did was the accounting. But when we opened up our technology to firms, we heard we competed. And so we decided to shut that down and only focus on firms. But now we're seeing other competitors. And I think a lot of the people in this room in the top 100 firms that are doing the work aren't looking at competition like Pilot and Bench. They're looking at other firms, traditional firms. And so it was a good conversation for them to be like, oh, there is a new competitor in town now. That competitor traditionally has just done the accounting. But what's happening with some of these venture capital based BPOs is they are starting to offer CFO services. And then some of them now are starting to offer tax services. And so they're evolving. And so it was a really good discussion. Do you think about that?
Yeah, I do all the time because as we look at even acquisition strategies, right, at these larger firms that are looking to acquire, traditional or non-traditional smaller firms, I think the conversation has started around, hey, what does a CAS only or BPO practice look like if we were to go acquire and incorporate that into larger firms? And that was one of the conversation points that came up today is there's going to come a kind of a merging point of sorts of as these BPOs are kind of going more upstream towards the different types of services a CPA firm provides in think about valuation, tax, transaction advisory services, all those kinds of things. And a BPO firm has historically been very ultra focused on just one area. Right. And so as they're evolving, they're coming up more towards the traditional accounting firm space. And
you're just going to,
right, and then you're going, hey, how about we just come together and kind of do this together? I think over the next few years, and several of us agree to that as part of the CAS leadership here, is that we're going to start to see a lot of consideration. At least I don't know if there's going to be transactional activity, but you're starting to see a lot of considerations given to what if we were to acquire BPO firms. And I know one of the big things holding it back today in those conversations is the profitability of BPO firms, because they tend to not charge as much and they have different thresholds. So and that's usually probably the first door you have to pass through. But I think as they start to evolve, I feel like that the CPA firms are going to try to find opportunity in that space.
And, sure. Well, we've been approached.
Yeah.
But we also have the AI. So we have it's the tech. A lot of it is our tech, right? But we really, you can never say never. But from my understanding is we want to empower firms. So all right. So that's one hot topic. Another one I was looking at our list that was yesterday that was really good was upskilling, because as technology and automation kind of automates the mundane work, and I think a lot of firms have a lot of that talent, right? But how do you upskill those talent to be more analytical and advisory? And it's kind of limited. A lot of CAS firms are having to create their own education. They're to train people how to upskill. I mean, it's the number one question I used to get all the time is, how can I upskill my talent? Where can I go? So I'd love, for you to share what you thought was interesting in that discussion.
Yeah, and I think in the CAS space, if you think about the context behind how these CAS practices came around, they were either stripped from an assurance practice or from a tax practice, and you still have a lot of legacy folks, and you're trying to go to colleges and recruit and try to get accountants and try to find a third track, besides audit and tax, to lure these graduates to come work for the CAS teams, right? So, there's an extra pressure put on for these CAS practices to go, well, what are we going to do in terms of learning and development for these folks, right? And so it's really catering to the legacy folks who, quote unquote, are bookkeepers, and we're trying to get away as an industry to use that word because technology does so much of it that that's really not a title you want to give a first year or second year person coming out of college and saying, hey, you're going to be an associate bookkeeper. Like, nobody wants that title, right? So it's the impetus is on us to come up with the right type of upskilling or skilling in general as they come up, right, through the ranks. So we look at, there's a technology component of it in terms of, how do you train people in all the different accounting technology that you're going to use? And then there's the actual advisory piece of it as to what you do with all of that data once the accounting part of it is done. What's fascinating at the same time that's happening is that at the AICPA level, the CPA.com level, all the thought leadership over the last decade it's now coming to fruition, which, for the last few years, we've looked at all of that and we've said, okay, we'll adopt when they get a little further along. And I think it was really eye-opening to see how far AICP has really come in their learning and upskilling model, where now they've got it broken out by, controller level 1, 2, CFO 1, CFO 2, and CVO, right? The chief value officer. We learn these terms all the time, and I think that's so fun and exciting and innovative to see that we're thinking far ahead as to, well, what's the need look like? Because face it, I mean, these trees don't grow overnight that we plant, right? It just takes years and years. So whatever we're thinking about planting today, it might be years from now that somebody's going to really, be able to sit under that shade, right? So it's fun. It's great to see how the merger of thought leadership's taking place around the learning space, and I thought that was pretty confirming of what we've been thinking all along. So,
well, what I thought was great is that what CPA.com and AICP has done is with the merger with SEMA, right, and the CDMA, they have training for the CDMA, and so they've been able to repurpose that training for the CAS track. And so not everybody in the CAS team needs to get their CDMA. They can now through this course, but you can take Controller 1 or Controller 2. And I know Nina at Witham was talking about how they're looking at using this because they want a common language amongst their team. And so everyone's going to go through Controller 1. They'll all have the same language of what Controller 1 is. And then people that go through, I think, CFO 1 will understand what Controller 1 is. And the other thing that I really like from that session is the titles that we give to our CAS staff doesn't resonate with our clients. And so what is it, like senior accountant or is senior manager? They were saying like lots of companies have a manager. That's like a very general term. Versus if we name them controller or CFO, then that resonates with the client and they understand the title. It's just a manager.
It's funny. I think there's an example brought up. Might have been Jessica at Woodfleet. She said that there was a manager at McDonald's that had applied because they just said manager CAS, and they said, oh, I could do this job because I know financials. And so it was really funny how we were talking about how people perceive manager, those titles, and what the lateralization of that might look like from an industry to industry. So lots to think about, right, on how we structure ourselves for sure. So
Okay, so another hot topic that we discussed yesterday was private equity. And we had a great panel because we had somebody from Eisner Ampner and we had somebody from Terry Becker that was on the panel talk. So two firms that have accepted the private equity. So go ahead, I'll let you start.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Fun stuff again, right?
Yeah.
A great topic. I think there's a lot of intrigue around, okay, how is that model working for firms, and not just purely from a CAS space. We did talk about that, but overall, what's that experience been like, right? So I think you had both firms expressing that it's yet to be determined what the ultimate, if we're going to be able to look back years from now and go, that was a really good idea, that was a really good move for the PE space to come into their firms. I think everybody's really just kind of in a wait and see approach in both of those firms, and just really seeing what is that going to do overall to the longevity of the firm, the long-term success of the firm, right? I think they're still in the early stages, which you're constantly comparing, what if we would have not taken it? But then at some point, I think that inflection point happens, that you're no longer looking back as much, and you're really adopting to the new environment. So both firms are, between 2 to 4 years in that space, and they're still kind of looking and going, okay, well, why did we do this? And some things are looking at going, wow, I'm so glad we did this, right? So there's kind of this dual thing going on, which I think over time will kind of start to become a little bit less amplified like it is right now. So
the thing with private equity that we're all seeing, is the acquisition, right? The firms that have taken the money are able to just acquire all these firms, but we're seeing it at a pace like unseen before. And so I just wonder, like, how many firms are going to be left, because firms continue to take private equity and merging into one. And so what does that mean, for the profession, for the smaller firms? But I also know what private equity is interested in is the client, because the firms have such great client relationships. And so they're really pushing for new revenue sources with the current client base. Okay, you've done tax forever with this client, but what more does this client need from the firm? And they're able to invest in new revenue sources like CAS. But you see these large firms expanding into cryptocurrency and ESG, and then there's discussion, well, should ESG be under CAS or is it separate? And then firms are acquiring HR companies, and so they're offering HR services. Well, all of that, in my opinion, can be part of CAS, right? Because CAS is also in its infancy, even though it's further along than some of these others. So that was a big part of the discussion that I found really interesting.
Yeah, and it's so much of it is unfolding almost daily, right? And I think what we heard a lot yesterday with both firms was, they see all the innovation and everything taking place, and it's almost sped up some of that innovation that they were not able to do before. So it's almost like, oh boy, let's get on this ride and let's keep up, because this thing's going to just go really fast. And I think on the flip side to it is okay, well, PE firms tend to have a short time span in whatever they acquire. So I think there's a little bit of anxiety arood, for lack of a better word, that what happens at that 5-year mark, that 7-year mark, right? And what does that point look like? And I think that's where there's a lot of cautious optimism, I guess, is that things will work itself out. Or are the PE firms here in the long game with this? So that's probably, I think, once we see those points and happen as part of their investment, I think a lot more people would feel a little bit more at ease around what this model could potentially do for them.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, well, then that ties into the next, I think, really nicely, is another hot topic that's being discussed next. So we haven't heard the session yet, is offshoring. And it kind of ties into, like, BPOs were the first to really offshore in the accounting CAS space, right? And then now I know private equity is really pushing for to use affordable talent, right? So to use the offshoring talent and to push everything to offshoring, to get that price down as low as possible for the client work so that you can be really profitable and have higher margins, right? So technology and offshoring is a big part of what PE is pushing firms to the model, right? So I'd love to hear what you think of the offshoring. I'm sitting on the panel, so I know what's going to be discussed, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Right. Well, it's one of those aspects of our practices, whether it's CAS or what's the overall accounting firm, that we owe it to ourselves to look at what that looks like, right? And I think several years ago when offshoring was starting to be talked about, we felt like that the pipeline was great in terms of talent, and the accounting pipeline with people coming out of college and things like that was pretty robust, that there was this thought process of, well, we don't really need to go there just yet, because we were turning down people for internships and all of that as well. So I think the market has also driven us to that point where, hey, in order to continue to stay, relevant and provide good service and things like that, that we've got to continue to build our pipelines. And I think with COVID and what happened with everybody going, remote, I think a lot of firms built that confidence and said, okay, well, if we can manage a remote practice, then why don't we just go offshore, right? And I think that's why you have a ton more firms, much more open, moving with confidence and with a deliberate speed in terms of going offshoring. And it has a ton of benefits, right? You think about higher profitability. You think about a workforce that you have an abundance of people that you can have access to, and a lot of times the talent for pound at say a first year staff person coming out of college, and you compare that to a first or second year person coming out from their educational system, whichever country that's in, and it tends to be pound for pound better, right? And so when you look at that and you say, okay, well, I'm paying half of that, in a lot of cases, sometimes even third of that, to go offshore and get better talent, and it starts to play into that business equation. Of course, from a PE perspective, I mean, they get it, right? They understand it, and it's now their narrative to come in and say, hey, we are going to try it.
Right.
Versus in a traditional accounting space, it was all about, well, let's try it for 10 people and see what happens, and we'll come back and report back in a year from now, right? So it's a much more aggressive push towards offshoring because you've got PE in this space.
So I think before firms tried it and it just didn't go well, and now to your point, it's a supply and demand issue, and there's always been a shortage of talent for firms, but it's just gotten to the point where they need, in order to be able to continue to grow, they need to go to offshore. There's challenges with offshoring. I mean, Botkeeper has an office in the Philippines for the last 8 years, and it is culturally different. Plus, it's very competitive. He told me that he has a friend that has a company in India. He made 117 offers, 36 people accepted, and guess how many people showed up to work?
What?
I was shocked.
Wow.
And I was like, but it's culturally different, because there it's hard. You can't give a 2 weeks notice. You have to give a 2 months notice. And so within those 2 months, they're interviewing and they accept about 10 jobs. And then when they quit, they determine which job they want to show up. And so it's competitive there in a different way. And it's the cultural, like, no one would do that in the States. I couldn't imagine not showing up to the first day of work.
Right.
But culturally, that's acceptable. And so there's pros and cons to it. I think the other thing that we're hearing is, again, the supply and demand, because everybody has started offshore and all the large firms are all offshoring, that people are jumping from one firm to another firm, right? And they like to get promoted. And so they want to do more meaningful work. And now the salary increases are going up. And our founder, Enrico, we have a office in Colombia for engineers, because there's a shortage of engineers in the States. And so our engineers are in Colombia, but he was saying if the accounting profession follows the engineering profession, the cost for engineers in Colombia is the same cost for engineers in the States. And so he thinks it'll follow. Now, that might take 5 to 10 years, but it is really starting to happen. So I think there's a lot of the benefits, but there's also a lot to discuss. Yeah, to determine if that's the right fit for you or not. I think there's different options. You can build your own, you can partner, with an offshore company, or you can acquire, right? And then there's different, if you acquire, it's expensive because they've built it out, right? If you partner, then you're sharing the cost, right? If you build your own, there's a learning curve, right? So what do you guys do?
So we partner with a firm
Okay.
to provide that in the Philippines as well. Now, one of the interesting things is what we find, and I think I'm hearing that from other firms as well, is that you have to put a different emphasis on what your culture looks like, because it's too different, right? Like you've got a offshore culture you're trying to build,
right,
and then you also have a U.S. culture that you're trying to build. So we're starting to, like, it's so funny, like the people that are involved with our offshore teams, they're really trying to research, if you show up to their office, do you bring a gift, or like what's appropriate to say and what's not appropriate to say. And so it's fascinating, but at the same time, you can't just walk in there, with taking them for granted, because there's a different type of interaction. And how, like, it's so interesting, we're seeing the emails they write and the emails we write, their emails are so formal, very well thought out, and then we write such informal emails, right? And it's fascinating because we look at that and go, oh my God, I need to kind of step up my game to make sure that
more polished.
And it's how they address you, you address them, and it's heartwarming, but it also it puts pressure on us, and in a good way, that we need to be more open-minded and more inclusive about how we do culture building and things like that.
So that's in the Philippines office. Enrico said in the Philippines, they're very like hierarchical. And so they are used to like being told what to do. And so getting like the free thinking and the collaboration and the communication has taken a ton of time, and to try to Americanize it. He said their managers and up have offices. So in the Botkeeper office in the Philippines, there are no offices. Everybody's on the floor, including himself. So he sits on the floor, he shakes hands, he kisses babies, he takes them out for dinner, to really try to encourage them to be a team and to collaborate. So it's taken a lot of time, especially with women that come to work and women with children, with daycare. And so all the benefits that we offer in the States, we offer to the Philippine office, which is not normal. So we decided to take a different route. So maternity leave, all the paid vacations, and also have to build different tracks for promotion because they like to get promoted. So building out all these different levels, giving them bonuses, like all of the structure we have in the States, we do there. And it's been to the point where the Botkeeper talent has asked to wear a uniform, because they want to be seen as working for this Americanized, isn't it? It's really wonderful. The impact that we can have. The other thing he said is education. So you want to go to a place that has a lot of universities and accounting education. So he spent a lot of time with the government, helping get the accounting degrees up to date, so that they're pumping out, the talent that's needed in that area. So it's an investment, I think. That's going to be wonderful for all. It's a new world, and we are still kind of learning that as well. Yeah.
There's so much, gosh, there's so much. And it's such a fun time to be in an accounting industry, or just the accounting space, right? We're all trying to
evolving.
At a much rapid pace than I've seen. It's so funny, we were doing the CAS 2030 session because we were trying to workshop our way through, hey, what does that look like 7 years from now? And it's funny, we all started with, what did it look like 7 years ago? And it was like, wow, we were so different 7 years ago than we are today. And if you multiply that rapid change plus probably add another exponent to it, you're like, wow, this is going to look so different.
Well, that was another thing during that session. ChatGPT kept coming up, right? Because that's still new. I mean, that's not even a year new. Everyone's talking about it. Dixie told me that she asked ChatGPT to write a procedures manual. And by vertical. And it was 10 times better than what she would have written. Now she's repurposed it, but
Right.
like having tools like
Sure.
that now where you don't have to build it yourself, right?
Right.
And that's the power
Right.
of the technology and the AI that I get excited by. I think a lot of people are worried.
Sure.
It's
Yeah, it's an evolution of how you incorporate technology into your work. It's not necessarily replacing you. It's how do I turn on my computer and my emails or my browser differently than you might have ever done it before.
Excel didn't replace you, calculators didn't replace you, QuickBooks didn't replace you. Like, it enables you, and that's how we feel. So we're at time. Thank you so much. This is a great session. Thanks.
Thank you.